It is Monday, the 23rd of August. Boris Johnson is appealing to Joe Biden to keep US forces in Afghanistan past the end of August. The president, meanwhile, keeping his options open.
Our hope is we will not have to extend, but there are going to be discussions, I suspect, on how far along we are in the process.
Sky News has spoken to a Taliban leader who says the 31st of August deadline is not up for discussion.
If they are intent on continuing the occupation, so it will provoke a reaction.
The Health Secretary promises to crack down on cowboy companies using the government's websites to advertise misleading COVID travel test prices. The Paralympics getting underway in Tokyo this week, with Team GB once again looking to get amongst the golds.
And finally, we have a fine weather forecast, and it looks like these settled conditions will stay with us until the bank holiday weekend. All the details coming up shortly.
Morning all. Boris Johnson will attempt to persuade Joe Biden to keep some forces in Afghanistan past the 31st of August, when the two meet in a virtual G7 tomorrow. Speaking in Washington last night, the US president said he hopes there will be no need to extend the airlift operation into next month, but admitted discussions are taking place. President Biden said the US has now airlifted 28,000 people from Kabul, while the latest Ministry of Defence figures show the UK has evacuated more than 5,700 from Afghanistan. Meanwhile, Sky News has spoken to one Taliban leader who says the group will not tolerate any extension, regardless of what is agreed between the US and the UK. Our first report this morning from our US correspondent, Mark Stone.
For this third appearance in a week, there was a fresh recognition from the American president of the challenges his decision has created.
Good afternoon.
And yet he did remain defensive.
Let me be clear. The evacuation of thousands of people from Kabul is going to be hard and painful, no matter when it started, when we began. It would have been true if we had started a month ago or a month from now.
It is now an international effort at the airport in Kabul. And President Biden is under clear pressure from allies to extend the August 31st deadline to have troops out.
There's discussions going on among us and the military about extending. Our hope is we will not have to extend, but there are going to be discussions, I suspect, on how far along we are in the process.
Of course, it's not clear how the Taliban or its offshoots would react to an extension or to the president's confirmation that the airport perimeter has been widened and his hints at extractions from across the country.
For security reasons, I'm not going to go into the detail of what these plans entail. But I will say again today that I have said before, any American who wants to get home will get home.
There certainly seemed to be a shift in tone this time. He was more empathetic to the situation on the ground and more robust in his assurances that anyone who arrives in America will be security screened in a third country before they get here. His approval ratings have plummeted in this crisis. He knows he needs to appeal to liberals who wonder where his empathy has gone, and to conservatives who fear social pressure and security issues with so many Afghans arriving. And at Dulles Airport near Washington, some of the more fortunate families stepped into a new world this weekend. The challenges ahead for them will be huge, and their presence here will further stir a divided nation. The president's gamble is that the chaos will soon be sorted, then forgotten, and he'll be remembered for getting the troops out.
My job is to make judgments no one else can or will make. I made them. I'm convinced I'm absolutely correct in not deciding to send more young women and men to war for a war that, in fact, is no longer warranted.
He has been driven by domestic politics, but up against that now, the global impact and America's credibility. Mark Stone, Sky News in Washington.
Well, let's speak now to the Armed Forces Minister, James Heappey. Mr Heappey, good to see you this morning. And, of course, plenty to discuss in terms of those conversations with the US President. But I wonder if we might begin just with an update on the state of the evacuation process. How many out and how many we perhaps expect to get out over the next 24 hours?
Indeed. So in the last 24-hour period across 8 flights, the Royal Air Force have extracted 1,821 people from Kabul. The flow remains good coming into the EHC at the Baron Hotel, and we expect to have a further 9 flights over the next 24 hours.
I wonder if you might confirm reports kicking around this morning, I think in the Times, that the evacuation programme has been significantly expanded. Last week we were hearing 4,000, then 6,000, to more than 12,000. Can you confirm that?
Well, it is certainly the case that as the cases have been made for more people from Afghan civil society to be evacuated, those names have been added. In reality, the focus is on the around 1,800 eligible persons, so UK passport holders, British nationals, and the remaining people under the ARAP scheme, which is about 2,275. But there are thousands more who we would like to get out if there is the time and the capacity.
When you say thousands more, can you put a figure on it slightly more specific than that?
The number changes all the time as people are sort of brought to our attention. And the fact is we will get out as many as we possibly can. But we've been clear throughout that there is a hard reality that we won't be able to get out everybody that we want to. And that's why it's very important that we start to reassure people in Kabul, because I know that people in Afghanistan are acutely aware of what is being said in our media here in the UK, that the airlift is not the only route out of Afghanistan. It is not the only route to the UK. There is a second phase to this where people will be able to be resettled in the UK, having been processed either at a handling centre in a refugee camp or at one of our embassies or high commissions in the region.
If we have learned anything about this government over the past 18 months, it is perhaps that on occasion, perhaps more than occasion, policy decisions taken at the very top happen at a glacial pace. There'll be people who will be pleased to hear the expansion of the numbers under ARAP, but the former Chief of the Defence Staff, Lord Dannett, was talking about this at the tail end of July. I mean, so too this conversation to take place with the US President. Why is that happening tomorrow? Why is that not happening today? Why did it not happen over the weekend? Why did it not happen, well, last Monday when your boss, the Defence Secretary, shed tears when he conceded back then that not everyone would be able to come out because of the time frame on the operation?
Well, firstly, I don't accept that characterisation of decision-making. What I've seen over the last 10 days as this Operation Pitting has been going on has been an extraordinary pace of decision-making across government. Decisions are being taken in real time to answer problems as they arise on the ground. And absolutely everybody here in Whitehall is focused on minimising the amount of policy friction for our people doing a very difficult job on the ground. Now, there is a wider question over whether or not we knew that Afghanistan would fall at the pace that it did. I don't think we did. I think our kind of worst case assumption was that it would take around 6 months to reach the point that we're at right now. And I don't know that we should...
It became clear a lot earlier than tomorrow that we would need to perhaps expand the amount of time that we are on the ground. Again, I'll ask the question, why has the Prime Minister not spoken to the President of the United States about this beforehand? It rather looks like the US President isn't willing to take his call. Is that the case?
The Foreign Secretary has spoken to Secretary Blinken. Yesterday, the Defence Secretary spoke to Secretary Austin. So we have been having these conversations with the Americans. But just to be clear, I think that everybody needs to understand that this isn't just a decision that gets taken in Washington. The Taliban get a vote on this as well. And I think it's far from certain that the Taliban are going to be willing to allow the international community to extend beyond the end of the month. And of course, we have...
We know that they're not willing. We know that they're not willing because news of this lobbying of the US president emerged. We were able to put a question directly to the Taliban in Doha. They have said that August the 31st is a red line. Their red lines tend to be written in blood. Sure, presumably the point at which we could have approached the Taliban about all of this was, a week and a half ago, where they were trying to work out where the toilets were in the presidential palace, rather than now, when they have complete security control of Kabul.
No, I don't recognise that this conversation could have happened a week or so ago, because I think nobody knew at that point the sort of scale of the challenge. In fact, if you look at the number of people that have been extracted in the last week, 6,631, that was pretty much the number that was our target when this operation began. So what's happened in the meantime is that people have come forward who have an eligibility under ARAP. They've been added to the list, and that's why there are still about 2,000 of them to extract, which we're working on very hard to do. And then beyond that, there has been an awful lot of people from civil society that were not in our plans, to be clear. They were not in our plans. There wasn't an eligibility. They weren't part of ARAP. But the UK government is trying to do the right thing. And I don't think we should apologise for that, that we have said we will try to bring out as many as we can. Now, that poses a big military challenge for the generals, admirals, air marshals that are planning this mission. But I don't know that it's a bad thing to want to stretch ourselves to bring out as many people as possible, rather than just to have stuck with our original number.
No one is suggesting that it is a bad thing, Minister. What we are suggesting is that we are lobbying the US president to extend beyond August the 31st, after the Taliban have said that they will respond, and presumably violently, if that were to be the case. I mean, is our time in Afghanistan solely predicated on the Americans? If they leave, do we have to leave? Have we really not investigated any other options, perhaps under NATO, for example, about remaining in that country if the US decides once again to cut and run?
Well, it is certainly the case that the mission in Kabul this week is fundamentally underpinned by a US presence, not just in terms of the number of troops that they have at the airport assuring its security, but also the role that the US Air Force are playing in delivering air traffic control and all of the other airfield services. So there is a hard reality that there would be no international airlift without the way that the United States are underpinning it. Now, whether or not the US can be persuaded to stay is a matter for the Prime Minister tomorrow in the G7 meeting, after the initial overtures made by both the Foreign Secretary and the Defence Secretary over the days previous. But the conversation with the Taliban will then follow, and the Taliban will have a choice. They can either seek to engage with the international community and show that they want to be a part of the international system, they want to be engaged in international diplomacy, or they can turn around and say, no, there's no opportunity for an extension. So, but I think everybody has to be clear that this is not just a discussion that happens amongst G7 leaders tomorrow. It's a discussion that then happens with the Taliban. If there's the opportunity to stay, we will. But right now, our military planning is focused on leaving on the 31st, because that's the deadline that is currently written down as when everybody must be out.
It occasionally feels like the Prime Minister's perhaps not as well informed about what is going on the ground as he perhaps should. Our correspondent, Stuart Ramsey, has produced some fantastic work in and around the airport, making clear the dire scenes that are facing many, many thousands, of course, the majority of whom who will not make it into the airport itself. On Friday, the Prime Minister said that things at the airport were getting better, where if he'd switched on Sky News, he would have been able to see that they were not. They were getting markedly worse at that point. Did the Prime Minister misspeak? Was he misinformed, or did he lie?
No, I also was on television on Friday saying that things were getting better, and they were, in so much as on the 24-hour period before Friday, we got 1,000 people out, which was a big acceleration on the number of people that we got out on any other day that week. And in fact, over the weekend, we then got another 1,000 out on Friday, and 1,800 out on Saturday, and another 1,800 out on Sunday. So in that sense, that shows that the flow into the HC at the Baron Hotel was improving. Now, the problem was, as everybody saw in the reporting coming out of Kabul, that there was also incredible crowd challenges on Saturday that caused 7 people to die in the crush outside the Baron Hotel. And I've seen the reporting that around the wider airport, there were more people killed further. That is horrendous. Our troops are operating in the most awful circumstances. Mm-hmm. What has changed over the weekend is that the Taliban have pushed the outer cordon further away from the Baron Hotel, which puts a bit more depth into the process. And also, if I may, Niall, they've also separated the US and the UK queues, which makes a big difference to the crush, because a lot of the crush that was outside the British gate were actually people trying to access the US system. It's important to note, as indeed your excellent correspondent has done, that once those changes were made, the situation yesterday was much safer, and we're all very relieved about that.
How has all of this affected your view of our relationship with the United States? I know from speaking to them that senior members of the cabinet are livid about the decisions taken by President Biden, particularly the tone that he struck in that very first statement. Why is no one saying this publicly? You yourself, sir, you will share the view of many people that you do not leave people behind. You do not cut and run. And that is what the US president has demanded of us.
Well, I mean, you're absolutely right that as an ex-soldier, there's a sort of deeply ingrained psyche that you never leave a man behind. And that's why we're working every minute that we can to maximise the number of people that we bring out. There is a reality to the fact that this airlift has to end, and that's why it's important to say that there are other routes to reach the UK in due course. But on the wider issue of UK-US relationships, no one's made any secret of the fact that we would have preferred a more conditions-based withdrawal. That point was made at the NATO summit, but NATO agreed collectively, the president is not wrong, that we went in together and we should all come out together. But from where I sit in the Ministry of Defence, I can tell you that right now there is a Royal Navy ship off Haiti working for the United States, facilitating their relief effort after the earthquake. I can tell you that there's a US warship and a US Marine Corps air detachment under command of the Royal Navy in the Philippine Sea, operating within our carrier strike group. The US and the UK are working together in sub-Saharan Africa, in the North Atlantic, in Eastern Europe. Around the world, the US and the UK remain the closest of allies. Of course, when you disagree with your closest friend, it hurts. It causes consternation on both sides of the relationship. But absolutely nobody should think that the US and the UK have anything but the deepest and strongest of relationships. And there's stuff going on around the world that shows that, even if right now in Afghanistan, there might be a little bit of disagreement.
Minister, good to have you on the programme this morning. Sorry for keeping you quite so long. Do appreciate it.
No problem at all. Thank you.
Now, what exactly do the Taliban make of the prospect of US or UK troops staying in Afghanistan past the 31st of August deadline? Someone who knows. Our correspondent Sally Lockwood, who sat down with a Taliban spokesman in Doha in Qatar. Sally, good to see you this morning. I suspect I already know the answer to this question, but they're not going to be particularly amenable to any extension, are they?
Absolutely not, in short, Neil. And it's very interesting to hear that Boris Johnson may try appealing to Joe Biden at this emergency summit tomorrow, appealing to him to extend this 31st of August deadline in order to continue these desperate evacuations, which we have seen going on for the last week. Well, I sat down with the Taliban spokesperson here in Doha, where they've had an office for several years now, and he was emphatic. He said that the withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan must be done by the 31st of August, that is a red line, that in short, if the US or the UK were to seek to extend that deadline in order to continue these evacuations, well, the answer is no, and there would be consequences.
So if they extend it, that means they are extending occupation. While there is no need for that, I think it will deteriorate the relation, will create mistrust between us. If they are intent on continuing the occupation, so it will provoke a reaction.
Now, I got to put several questions to Dr. Sohail Shaheen about these desperate scenes that we've been seeing at Kabul airport, this fear that people have of their potential, or their future rule in Afghanistan. I said to him, it's not normal to see people clinging to aircraft leaving a country during political transition. I said, what would you say to these people? He said, they have nothing to fear, they have nothing to be scared of. And he said to me that he dismissed their fear and called them economic migrants. He said this is what's driving them, is their desire to live in a Western country, not because there's any fear of a Taliban rule. I also asked him about women's hard-fought rights in Afghanistan, the fact they can now have careers, they can go to university, they can wear what they want, they can socialise with who they want. I asked him what they stand to lose under Taliban rule. He said they will lose none of their freedoms, only be asked to wear a hijab. That was it, he said. They could continue to work, they could continue to be educated. I also asked him about these worrying reports we've been hearing about the Taliban going house to house, threatening people. He dismissed it as fake news. And of course, as this deadline approaches in just around 8 days' time, I asked him what he would say to the families of those who died trying to help Afghanistan. He said, they occupied our country, but the past is the past, and now they want to look to the future, which very much seems to be the date after 31st of August is the future they are looking to, a date that they say is a red line, non-negotiable. Troops must be out of the country.
Sally, many thanks indeed. Well, in the Afghan capital, thousands of people remain stranded at the airport, desperate to escape. A military commander there has said the UK troops leading the evacuation effort are facing challenges nobody has experienced before. Our chief correspondent, Stuart Ramsey, reports.
It's a sort of purgatory. Day, night, it makes no difference. In their thousands, they just have to wait. And they're sleeping rough, hoping for news. Hoping they can get into the system. A system that will get them out of Afghanistan. The truth is, most of them probably won't. Thousands of children, parents and grandparents grabbing sleep or basically passing out from exhaustion. The struggle never stops. No food, little water. But it is cooler at night. When the sun comes up, the true horror of the conditions they're living in is obvious. And it is absolutely dreadful. They're penned in. This is the American section of the processing chain. Higher security alerts means there's no movement allowed. There is no shade here, only what can be fashioned from scarves and plastic. Soldiers slowly try to work through the paperwork of the evacuees, but the conditions are getting stricter and more are failing the test of eligibility. But for everyone here, even these awful conditions are better than what may await them outside the military lines.
Outside this Taliban is kicking the people with a rifle, with everything. I put in a wood with the people. You gotta check in. Outside this Taliban is very fighting with the people.
At the British end of the process, the Taliban and paratrooper cooperation is actually working quite well. And you couldn't make this up. Taliban fighters oversee the crowds from sea containers the paras put in to create a screening barrier.
Well, it's an incongruous sight having the Taliban right next to and, in fact, through the British lines. As you can see in front, it's much calmer here. The British military are able to process people, and I think what they've done is got the message through to the local people. If you're rioting and shouting and screaming and people are getting hurt, there's no way that this can be processed properly. So for now, at least, it's calm. I mean, there'll be anxiety. It'll change. It always does. But this is a lot better than yesterday, a lot better.
Containing the crowds is vital here. Clearing up this evacuation mess requires some pretty lateral thinking. Obviously, after 20 years of fighting, this is something of a culture shock for the soldiers, but also for the Taliban.
The main thing for us is to make sure that we have a smooth possible system to get those entitled people through. And at the moment, that involves an element of the Taliban being here alongside us, as you will have seen while you've been here. And ultimately, we have to put our thoughts of previous tours aside, because ultimately everybody is trying to get the same situation here, which is avoid a humanitarian crisis and bring those people through that need to be.
But it's just the strangest thing, isn't it? Strange times, I suppose.
It's strange times, but like I say, if we weren't here, who would be? It needs to be done. And as you said, everybody's feeling it, but ultimately you put that to one side and get on with the job.
This is now a multinational nightmare, not just the US and Britain. In the crowds, they try to identify themselves to the soldiers and foreign services of countries they have links to. Their days are spent hoping someone will spot them and take them out of this hellhole and onto a plane. The wait is often days and days. In the horrendous rush to get here, families have been split. Posters for missing children are dotted amongst the crowds. People search for their loved ones in a daze of panic. But this is a tough environment. Only a few will make the flights, only some will go as a complete family, and nobody knows how long they have. It is purgatory. Stuart Ramsey, Sky News, Kabul.
And of course, much more from Stuart all this week. But still to come on this programme, with the Prime Minister set to urge President Biden to push back the deadline for US troops to be pulled out of Afghanistan. At 7:45, we'll be speaking to the UK's former ambassador to Washington, Sir Peter Westmacott. Education under the Taliban. Aid groups hope that they can continue providing schooling to children across the country. Marching for climate change. I'll be speaking to an 11-year-old travelling 200 miles on foot to raise awareness. Now, nearly 20% of companies offering COVID testing for travel have been accused of cowboy behaviour by the Health Secretary over the pricing of their tests. Joining us, our reporter Aisha Zahid. Aisha, good to see you this morning. What is going on here? It's quite an accusation from the Health Secretary.
Yeah, that's right. Well, after a government review, they found that many providers listed on their website providing COVID tests for holidaymakers had misleading prices. A lot were listing the prices much lower, and then when you actually went through the checkout processes, they went up after additional fees were added. And it led to 57 providers being removed from the list. Some of these don't even exist anymore or aren't providing the correct COVID tests holidaymakers need. And 82 have been given a 2-strike warning. It means if they advertise misleading prices again, they will be removed from the list. It's a 2-strike system. After having 1 strike, the companies have 3 days to act upon this, and if not, they are served that 2nd strike. And there will also be regular spot checks as well to ensure prices are accurate, to ensure providers are also following the rules, and to make sure that those who have been removed don't just change their names and come back to be added back onto that list. Now, this cowboy behaviour, Sajid Javid has said that the crackdown will be harsh on these companies that are taking advantage of holidaymakers. And as well as this, a separate review will be conducted by the Competition and Markets Authority, and they will be particularly focusing on concerns around the high cost of PCR tests.
Aisha, many thanks indeed. Let's take a quick run through some of the day's other main stories now. And New Zealand's Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern has extended the country's level 4 lockdown until at least midnight on Friday. The shutdown has been extended even further in Auckland, which is currently experiencing a surge in cases of the highly transmissible Delta variant. Across the city yesterday, 35 new cases were recorded, taking the total number of infections in the current outbreak to 107. At least 21 people are thought to have died as a result of flooding in Tennessee. As rainfall hit record levels for the US state on Saturday, homes were washed away and property destroyed. Among those thought to have died, twin babies who were swept from their father's arms as he tried to take them to safety. Storm Henri has continued its journey through northeast America, causing flooding in states such as New York and New Jersey. President Biden has declared disasters in much of the region, promising federal help just as soon as possible. Residents have also been warned that disruptions caused by the storm could last for days. Let's check in, see how the weather is looking at the start of the week. Joe is standing by. Give me some good news, Joe.
I have good news. The weather is looking good this week. We've actually got high pressure in control. We've waited till late August to see this. And once it's here, it looks like it's going to last until the bank holiday weekend. Let's take a look.
Look forward to brighter skies. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Hello there, good morning to you. Yes, high pressure in control. It's centred over the northern parts of the country, which is going to give us a northerly flow, which is a little bit cooler than we might have had if we'd been dragging some air up from the Mediterranean, say. And through the course of the week, we will find a little bit of early mist and fog, some cloud around first thing this morning. That will clear, and as I say, we're looking at some really good sunny spells today. Temperatures, nothing to write home about, but in light winds, it'll feel quite pleasant. We're looking at the low 20s Celsius with a high, say, of around 24, that's 75 degrees Fahrenheit. As we go into this evening and overnight, though, we are going to see the mist and the fog reforming, a little bit of low cloud spilling over those North Sea coasts. So tomorrow we do it all again. The mist, the fog, the cloud disappears, and we're looking at another sunny day and a little bit warmer.
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Joe, thanks very much indeed. After the break, we'll be discussing this, that meeting of the G7. They'll be discussing how to handle the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan. That's after this.
I think that we're really ecstatic to be back on stage. We're really ecstatic that we can go out and do stuff now. And I mean, the 18 months was difficult, but we used our time well because we made a new album called The Journey. So that, every cloud has a silver lining, as they say. So we did that. It's over 4 years ago since, things changed for us in that department. So, yeah, Kevin's come in. He's done a fantastic job, and he's given a new lease of life to us. We've written some new songs, which was, I felt that after the last singer stepped out, it was time for us to do something musical, and, that's what Kevin enabled us to do. So he's been doing an amazing job.
It was obviously really difficult because I think we kind of got a little bit of momentum going just before the pandemic hit. So we were out sort of gigging a lot, doing festivals in the UK and abroad, doing our own tours. And yeah, I felt like we'd sort of gained a bit of momentum. And then obviously everything just stopped. And it's a little bit like that, to be honest. Like Graham said, we've done quite a few festivals recently, and I still get those pre-show nerves of like how many people know the different lineup to the band, and it does sort of, I feel like I'm sort of having to prove myself every time I go on stage, but I'm enjoying the what would I say, the challenge of it.
I use not only design but biology to create new materials which actually are fully sustainable and biodegradable. Because of COVID, there was a mass increase of single-use plastics being discarded. So for me, it seemed like a great opportunity to have a material which didn't have a longevity of plastic but could degrade back into the earth.
Welcome back. In just the last few minutes, the Armed Forces Minister James Heappey has given the clearest indication yet that UK troops will have to pull out of Kabul on the 31st of August if the government is unable to persuade the Americans to stay beyond that date. Let's take a look.
It is certainly the case that the mission in Kabul this week is fundamentally underpinned by a US presence, not just in terms of the number of troops that they have at the airport assuring its security, but also the role that the US Air Force are playing in delivering air traffic control and all of the other airfield services. So there is a hard reality that there would be no international airlift without the way that the United States are underpinning it. Now, whether or not the US can be persuaded to stay is a matter for the Prime Minister tomorrow in the G7 meeting, after the initial overtures made by both the Foreign Secretary and the Defence Secretary over the days previous. But the conversation with the Taliban will then follow, and the Taliban will have a choice. They can either seek to engage with the international community and show that they want to be a part of the international system, they want to be engaged in international diplomacy, or they can turn around and say, no, there's no opportunity for an extension.
Well, as usual, as you can see, Tamara Cohen joining us in the studio. Morning again, Tamara. What do we make of that? I mean, it's pretty stark from the Armed Forces Minister, although he, of course, he is not the Defence Secretary, he's not the Foreign Secretary, he's not the Prime Minister.
Yes, but he was pretty clear that when the US decides it's time to close that air bridge from Kabul airport that's taking people out, then everyone else will have to leave as well, because the US are keeping the airport running. They are running the air traffic control. They're running all of it. And although he made clear that Boris Johnson will be seeking to persuade Joe Biden to extend the deadline beyond the 31st of August when they speak at that emergency G7 meeting tomorrow, as he said, there's already been discussion of this with the Foreign Secretary and the Defence Secretary speaking to their US counterparts, and it didn't sound like much had been achieved so far. So can the US President be persuaded? And bluntly, if he can't, then that is it. Now, I know that the Cabinet are working up plans for people who don't get on these flights, and I thought it was interesting that he confirmed to you that we're looking at far more people than we were even a week ago. We've already got out 6,600 people, and there are thousands more to go, because it's expanding all the time, with people in humanitarian groups and so on making the case that their employees should be allowed to get on the planes too. So it's far more people than we expected, but he made clear that when this ends, there may be chances for them to get out through land borders, and there'll be processing centres in other countries. But how long all that will take is very unclear at the moment.
Tamara, for now, thanks very much indeed. Well, as we were just discussing, in fact, the leaders of the G7 will be meeting tomorrow to discuss the situation in Afghanistan. Top of the agenda, as we've been hearing, those appeals to Joe Biden to keep US forces in Afghanistan past the end of August. Fair to say, Mr Biden seems somewhat reluctant. Joining us now on the programme, former EU Special Representative for Afghanistan, Vigodas Ušakšas. Mr Ušakšas, thank you very much for joining us in the programme, and apologies for no doubt butchering the pronunciation of your name there. I do apologise. It is very early on a Monday morning. But I wondered if we can start, as someone who has clearly spent an awful lot of time dealing with the Afghans, being in Afghanistan, your thoughts on what you have seen over the past week and a half?
Well, of course, it's very sad and disappointing, having spent, almost 4 years in Afghanistan, shoulder to shoulder with the Afghans, but also with the Brits, with Americans, to see, how we are losing. But I think the time is not to celebrate the loss. The time is to help those who deserve to be flown out of Kabul, of Afghanistan. First of all, citizens of the Western governments, but also those translators, the drivers, and other assistants. At the same time, I think it's important not to lose sight that current evacuation should not overwhelm diplomatic and political efforts. We have truly a window of opportunity, not to recognize immediately, but to engage with Taliban forces, especially political element in Kabul, because they have provided initially a pretty constructive soundbites. Yes, we cannot be complacent when they say they're going to respect women's rights according to Sharia. They will form inclusive government. They will not allow Afghanistan become again a source for international terrorism. They will accept humanitarian assistance. Having said this, not being complacent, we have to engage. Otherwise, the China and Russia will do on behalf of us.
The Taliban have also been pretty clear about the date of the August of 31st. We've spoken to one of their spokesmen in Doha, and they have made it very, very clear that they view that as the cut-off point, an absolutely definitive red line for them.
Well, I mean, I think Taliban also understand that the conflict and the challenges which arise from Afghanistan will not be fixed by artificial or political deadlines. Hence, we have to be realistic and to see what needs to be done in order to ensure evacuation is expanding. At the same time, again, I think it's important that we do not only showcase how effectively we help our citizens, but start planning and start delivering, or at least offering, what we can do on humanitarian assistance. Because that's what the United Nations are called about. That's what the European Union is going to do anyway to help those people who will be suffering across the lines.
Diplomatically, though, what are the levers that we can use to nudge the Taliban administration towards something more palatable to Western eyes? I mean, they are, as an organisation, in many people's minds, completely antithetical to the Western way of life.
Well, I think, first of all, we have to recognize that there will be no perfect solution anytime soon in Afghanistan. There will be an Afghan solution which will not correspond to democratic Western ideas and democratic principles. Secondly, and I think what the lessons have taught us during the last 20 years, the West and G7 alone will not fix Afghanistan. We'll have to engage Russia and China in order to avoid that we continue proxy wars in Afghanistan, and we'll have to talk to the neighbors, Pakistan, Iran, whether we like it or not, because they are immediate neighbors. Afghanistan is a country roundabout the heart of Asia, in-law country, and we'll have to talk to them and find a common solution. And the time to talk to Taliban is now, on the basis of what I've thought a very constructive consensual agreement, which was issued by United Nations Security Council on the 16th of August. Everyone, China, Russia, and the West, and other permanent members of Council, United States, of course, UK and France, have agreed to work on Afghanistan and called and push Taliban to respect women's rights, to ensure that the country does not turn back into the terrorist cellar. And the leverage we have is financial and humanitarian assistance. At the end of the day, Taliban will realize that they are not only fighting, but they will have to assume the public services, the health services, the financial system, which is in catastrophe. And for that, China and Russia alone will not deliver. The G7 won't deliver either. So we need to work together. And the UN is probably the best umbrella to reapproach Taliban at this particular stage.
Mr. Yusakshis, good to have you in the programme this morning. Really appreciate your time.
Welcome.
Still to come on the programme, I'm going to be speaking to the former UK ambassador to the United States, Sir Peter Westmacott. That's next.
They can't go back to Myanmar yet. If they do, they fear they'll be killed.
We take you to the heart of the stories that shape our world. If there is a bigger explosion, this area would be in the danger zone.
These traffic jams snake for hours up and down this hillside. It means precious aid can't access those in need.
You can see the depth of the water. If you have a look in front of us, there are people wading through it.
I think experiencing the 2 million person march in Hong Kong, that was a moment.
I don't like the Chinese government. It's cruel.
It was real people power in action.
Police have been firing tear gas and rubber bullets.
These fires all around us here, and just one of them is the size of around 31,000 football pitches.
Siobhan Robbins, Sky News, Bangkok.
Did you know that reducing pollution outside of school can help stop toxic air getting trapped in our classrooms?
It's a bit of a grey start to the day with a fair amount of cloud, low cloud, mist and fog around, but much of that will thin and clear to give some bright or sunny spells. In fact, the afternoon looks even better as the cloud melts away, and we're looking at temperatures into the early 20s, perhaps peaking at around 24 Celsius. That's 75 degrees Fahrenheit. In terms of air pollution levels, we're looking at a low count just about everywhere today, particularly as we start to pick up some coastal breezes.
The Air Quality Report, sponsored by Philips Air Purifiers.
Now, the Prime Minister is expected to use an emergency meeting with world leaders tomorrow to try to push the US President Joe Biden to extend the evacuation deadline in Kabul. That comes after a weekend of talks between the Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab, the Defence Secretary Ben Wallace and their US counterparts. But let's speak now to Sir Peter Westmacott, formerly, of course, British Ambassador to the United States. Sir Peter, good to see you again. What is your assessment of exactly what is going on in terms of the transatlantic relationship at the moment? As mentioned, the Defence Secretary, the Foreign Secretary, and tomorrow, we are told, the Prime Minister, all to lobby Joe Biden to try and extend beyond August the 31st. What chance of that happening?
Well, everybody is scurrying around now to show that they are talking to their American counterparts. There obviously was disappointment that the decision to evacuate all American military troops from Afghanistan was taken as it was, and with such a short timetable. And after the president had assured everybody, I assume at Cornwall, at the G7 chaired by Boris Johnson back in June, that the Americans were going to leave enough of a military presence there for everybody to stay on in Afghanistan, in Kabul. And that happened. So there is an unseemly scramble, and we've seen what Tony Blair has said over the weekend. And he's a very pro-American former Prime Minister. So there is obviously widespread disappointment, and there's been some briefing from government sources about their disappointment at the way in which the US administration has handled this and how long it took the president to return Boris Johnson's phone call last week, and so on. So now, with the UK in the chair of the G7, there is a chance for us to try to make a difference. That will require a lot of careful homework, a lot of preparation, a lot of bilateral phone calls in advance, which is why we've seen this activity over the weekend, partly, I'm sure, to do with the criticism of individual ministers that we've seen in the UK media about being on the beach at the wrong time and so on. But I think that's essential preparation. Is there a reasonable chance of getting that deadline of the 31st of August extended? I would have thought yes, because President Biden, in his third broadcast yesterday on the subject, said that he was hoping he would get everybody out by the 31st, but that if there was a need to extend, he would consider that. Of course, it would help a lot if there is an understanding with the Taliban, who are now in charge in Kabul, if they agree because this is a timetable that was agreed behind the backs of the Afghan government, I should add, between the United States and the Taliban in their negotiations in Doha. So it does really need to be fixed with them. But the anecdotal evidence that I'm hearing on the ground is that the Taliban leadership, to the extent they are in control of the people there, are at least sticking to their word and helping at least the expatriates get to the airport and out. The problem is much more for those Afghans for whom we've all got a moral responsibility, who used to work for us or for international organizations and so on, but whose lives are also in danger. And so that's the real challenge for the next few days and perhaps weeks.
You mentioned reassurances that Joe Biden, presumably, as you say, gave it the G7 in Cornwall. Did it need to be like this, Sir Peter? I've lost count of the number of times over the past week and a half that I have been told by supposedly better informed people than I that they just didn't see this coming.
I think two comments, Neil. One, did it need to be like this? No. I think most people who have followed recent events in Afghanistan would say that it wasn't a binary choice between all out or putting in more troops, as the American president has said. There was no very good reason why you couldn't carry on much as we have been for a number of months. After all, the British, for example, finished all combat operations in Afghanistan, I think it was 7 years ago, and the Americans some time back. And there was pretty minimal risk, very little loss of life, thank God, in the status quo, which was manageable and which was giving Afghanistan a chance of getting its act together. So you could have carried on like this for quite a long time. And there was disappointment initially back in April when Biden followed on the Trump policy of withdrawal. He just extended the deadline from the 1st of May to the anniversary of 9/11. It didn't need to be like this. It could have continued, not brilliant, but at least with minimal loss of life and with a chance of Afghanistan kind of working, and with women and girls having a modicum of respect, human rights, education, jobs. There were, of course, lots of people being murdered, independent-minded MPs, journalists, lawyers were being butchered on a daily basis by the Taliban. Not good at all, but I don't think it was as binary a choice as the president made out. And I think that's the view in London. So I think that is the reality. We could have gone on like this, not perfect, but a lot less bad than what we're looking at the moment.
So, Peter, what diplomatic sway do we actually possess in Washington, D.C. at the moment? The Defence Secretary, the Foreign Secretary, as mentioned, both rebuffed. A point I put to the Armed Forces Minister this morning. Why has the Prime Minister not made this request of President Biden before now?
You know, I don't know what conversations there were in the margins in Cornwall during the G7, but it looks as though the UK government, along with others, did not see this coming as quickly as it did happen. Whether or not there was intelligence failure, I don't know. There's been lots of people out there saying, oh no, the intelligence people did know what was happening and they advised President Biden not to do this, and he disregarded that advice. I'd like to think that advice was given to senior British ministers to lobby very hard in Washington. Did they do so or not? I don't know. But one of the realities of likely over the years, whether it is George Bush, whether it is Ronald Reagan, whether it was even Barack Obama when I was ambassador there, is that the American system does tend to take its foreign policy decisions on its own through the process of its own National Security Council and then tell its allies what it's done and invite us to go along with those policy decisions. They're not brilliant, and it's partly because of machinery rather than political will at seriously consulting their allies. And so we're often left on different subjects, different places, different parts of the world, scrambling to be the loyal and faithful ally. And I think what's happened now is, first of all, disappointment that Biden was not different to some of the earlier presidents, having talked a lot about consensual foreign policy and working with allies, but also the realization that with the United Kingdom having declined to form any kind of foreign and security policy arrangement with the rest of the European Union when we left, we said, no, thanks, we don't want anything to do with you all on that. We're now a bit on our own, left with the United States, who've turned out to be, particularly on this subject, dare I say it, something of a disappointment.
Sir Peter Westmacott, great to have you on the programme once again. We will no doubt see you again soon. Thanks for joining us. Time for us, though, to have a quick look at the weather. Here's Joe.
Look forward to brighter skies. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Hello there, good morning to you. Well, the weather is looking good. We've got high pressure in control, but it is centred at the north of the country, which is going to give us rather a cool northerly flow rather than dragging up some heat from the south. But certainly first thing this morning, we've got a bit of low cloud around, some mist and fog, so it's a bit murky in places, but much of that should lift through the course of the morning. We'll see some sunshine. The sunshine better still through the afternoon, temperatures widely in the low 20s Celsius, and we could see a high of 24 degrees Celsius, 75 degrees Fahrenheit, which will feel very pleasant in light winds.
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.